we're going to go ahead and discuss on setting up the exporter for Painter, preparing our textures, our final product here, and getting it back into Maya, and then rendering it using RenderMan. Now the cool thing is that Painter is super easy as far as that setup now, at least as long as you have the 2020 version or higher. It does support a RenderMan export. While prior versions you had to create your own, which wasn't a big deal. It was just a little bit more set up for us. But once it was set up, it was pretty much good to go. But now it's just built in. Now we have to understand a couple things before we kind of do that. Or at least I want to clarify what we take out and why we take out what we do. Right. So when we look at our texture set list, or I'm sorry, our texture set settings, the channels we've been working with, we've kind of already discussed this a little bit. We had our base color, the height, the roughness, the metallic, and the normal, right? And hopefully these have started to make a little bit more sense as you've kind of worked away. But if we were to go back into, say, Maya and look at the RenderMan material, you'll notice these are not necessarily named the same, all right? So this one's called diffuse, and then we have like specular. We still have roughness, right? But we actually have roughness in several different locations. In fact, many different locations, several of them. And it's in your best interest to kind of at least understand the basics of how this shader works, so you know how to kind of connect various attributes or maps or whatever it is you want to kind of connect to those. Now, we're not going to go into extreme detail with this particular shader. This is considered a monolithic shader. So what I mean by that is it's a shader that can generate just about anything you need it to be. Skin, car paint, grass, leaves, trees, plastic, metal, you name it, it can make it. Now, for things like hair, there's a better shader for that. But for pretty much everything else, this is kind of your go-to shader. And when I say shader, shader is just essentially a piece of code that can do multiple things. So it's essentially having an input, an output, and then it generates the result you're looking for. So even math nodes would be considered shaders. So if you've ever been in Hypershade and you see like that multiply and divide node, it's technically a shader, right? It's just a very specific shader. This is a very large, very multifaceted shader. So again, in Painter, these are the channels we're working with, right? So we could technically click on this little plus icon and add those channels we're working with. So like base color to diffuse or something along those lines. But in my opinion, this is not going to be a very optimal way to work. And only because PBR is just such an easy, streamlined method of working. It just makes sense for a lot of artists, Color is color, height is height, roughness is just how rough it is. Is it metallic, yes or no? And that's pretty much it. When dealing with specular, it gets a little bit weirder, right? Because specular is doing two things. One, it can make it look metallic. It can also control the intensity of reflection. Roughness is still the same. Diffuse is going to look a little bit differently because of the way we're treating any metallic areas and things like that. So they interact differently. They're not a one-to-one translation. More often that is the case. So we have to be super cautious about that. And depending on which renderer you use, whether it's V-Ray, RenderMan, Arnold, whatnot, you may have to use different maps or substitute different maps. So it's good to understand how to take it from Painter, and that way we can kind of connect it properly, right? So for instance, V-Ray might use glossiness, right? So we have to understand how to convert roughness to glossiness. They are not the same. If we're using a shader that supports metallic, then we can just use the traditional PBR export from Painter and just connect things appropriately, and it should work. All right, so let's kind of dive in a little bit. Have you guys kind of explored the Pixar surface a little bit in like shading and lighting or anything like that? Do you guys have any familiarity with it? Because I'm curious. I don't know what they kind of teach you guys as far as this shader.
I think the furthest I've experimented it for Pixar surfaces like displacement maps. Although other than that, we've just been like messing with like just these base colors, like try and get to the level of the presets you can pick from in that little list that they have for materials. Like in terms of
the preset
like how
library.
reflective.
This
Yeah,
guy that's all jacked up on my screen now. Can I move this?
yeah, those like we like basically practice like how to get to that quality without having to rely on that preset.
So these presets are fine. These are great like little starting points, but no different than the presets back in Painter, right? We want to modify them to give them a bit more life. I won't actually be using this. You can. There's nothing wrong with them. Some actually have some pretty decent textures. They're great like little placeholders, if you will. And we could technically actually author. So let's say we create our table. We assign all our textures. We can actually save that as a preset, give it a little picture and everything, and then actually apply it in the future, which is kind of cool. That's what this is kind of designed around, not just using these here. This is what you're talking about, right? These little guys here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We're going to dive in a little bit more here, so at least you understand the core attributes when it comes to working with the Pixar surface. Again, it's a really complicated shader. It's a very, very powerful shader. So the first thing I usually recommend, and I know it's going to be cliche, but the help docs, right? Actually, let me open this up in Firefox. No one uses Explorer. Go away. You have no friends.
You still have Explorer. I thought they switched to Edge.
Was that Edge? I don't know. I call it Explorer.
That was like normal. Yeah, that was normal Explorer. Like, what the heck is that doing there?
I don't
went
even
extinct.
use it.
Gotta change the default.
All right, so the documentation here, and the only reason I bring this up is because it is that good, right? Normally, I'm sure we've all experienced this. We've gone to the documentation, and it's just this cryptic programming language of nonsense. I have to give RenderMan, and actually a lot of studios lately, a bit more credit. They've done a great job of kind of making sure that the documentation's a bit more artist-friendly. So this includes pictures for us, yay. So we can look at things like diffuse parameters, and it'll take us to those attributes, and we can kind of see what every single channel or every single attribute is doing for us, and how that's working. And they actually do a really good job of trying not to be super wordy or super technical about things, but sometimes it's just going to be unavoidable, right? So a lot of these are just really well kind of broken down into basics. So things like specular, and we have a little compare slider here, or how we can kind of connect things in and get different results, and very, very artist friendly. And I highly recommend, if there's any attribute you have any question, in fact, even if it's just lights or anything RenderMan, look at the documentation. They do a really good job, and it only benefits you, right? So this should be your starting point. Like, let me just see what's kind of going on here, and then maybe you kind of search out and see what others are saying, right? What better source than the actual developers themselves? So the documentation, you can always just click on that little question mark. You can always, I believe, you can do like help on Pixar Surface up here. It should. Yeah, just going to take you right there as well. But let's go ahead and dive in here. So I'm just going to, I have a simple scene set up. This is not the way the light should be set up, but I just have something so I can sit here and render this real quick. So we get a really, really simple result. I'm going to go ahead and hit Shift-T. I just want to assign a new material, because if I change this one, this is the default, I'm going to end up changing all of them. Not really optimal for testing. So I'm going to hit Shift-T. I'm going to type in Pixar. We'll go down to our RenderMan. So these are like little filters, by the way. I don't know if you've ever kind of played with these. But if you just type in something here, we can find what we're looking for. There's my Pixar surface. And if you're really savvy, you can right click on this and add it to your favorites, and this way you can just go up here and click on it. So a little less searching. It's up to you, doesn't really matter. But I do believe by default it'll try either doing favorites or Maya, so you won't actually see anything. Just be aware of that. We'll call this test material, and let's go ahead and kind of play with this. So diffuse is probably the easiest one to understand. I think everyone kind of gets this one. It's just color, right? So if I change the color, big surprise, it kind of changes, right? So we're not going to spend too much time on that one, but rarely are we ever just going to use a solid color, right? Just like in Painter, we want to avoid just using Lamberts, right? It's just going to look flat and dead. So this is where we would connect our texture, right? So if we had our diffuse texture, we would connect this, and that would define the color of this actual object. Now, the takeaway attributes here, we have gain and roughness. Now this roughness is not going to work like the roughness we've been using back in Painter. This is actually very, very different. So let me go ahead and change this color a little bit. And we're going to go ahead and zoom in on this a little bit. In fact, what we can do is we can actually do a crop region in the viewer, which is kind of nice. So this will render a little bit faster. And we have this attribute called gain. So gain, the easiest way to think of gain, think of it as a multiplier. So if the gain is set to 0, we're essentially turning off a layer, or we're turning off an attribute. So if I set this to 0, it goes away, right? Well, it doesn't go away. It's still there. So if we have like specular or something like that, it would still be there. I'm just turning off the diffuse. Now, why this is powerful is I can do something like 0.5, and this will be like a multiplier to my colors. So if my object is too bright, and you can kind of see that adjacent to it where it didn't change, it didn't update because I'm not rendering it, I can actually just make this a little bit darker. So if it's a little too bright, I can darken that very, very quickly without modifying my actual texture. I don't have to go back to Painter and modify it. Most objects in the real world have a very low diffuse, typically pretty dark. We'd say around 0.6. 0.5. Very rarely we ever push. Honestly, like even a sheet of white paper wouldn't be 100% white, right? It's just not. So just be aware of that, because what tends to happen when we render this is it just tends to be too bright. So I'll always kind of knock the gain back a little bit. Artistically, again, you can still do whatever you want. I'm not here to tell you otherwise. I'm just saying you can control the brightness via the gain. Now the roughness here, let me go ahead and turn off my wireframe on shaded here. So we'll do selection highlighting off. So this one is kind of a unique attribute. So it's the roughness on the diffuse is, again, completely separate from that of what we've been working with in Painter. This is essentially change it from a Lambertian model to an Ornaire model. Props if you even know what those two words mean. So a Lambertian model is essentially what we have here. The roughness is set to 0. So the highlights on the diffuse model are going to look like a traditional highlight. So diffuse highlighting. If I set this to 1, it's going to be a really subtle effect. It's pushing the highlights outward, giving it almost a softer look, almost like a powdery surface. So we can simulate, again, powdery surfaces like this, or sometimes I'll do this for fabric to give it a kind of a softer look. But again, it's up to you artistically. Again, here's at 0. If you pay very close attention to like this area right here, you can see we get that diffuse highlight. And then at 1, it's just going to be just softer, super subtle. We typically don't map this, but you could. All right. So again, we are not going to connect our roughness map here. I've seen this mistake done several times. It's not going to look correct. All right. Moving down, now one thing I can do to help preview specular. So specular is just controlling reflection or reflection intensity. So we have 2 attributes here, face color and edge color. I'm going to go ahead and set this face color to white. So essentially I'm making this reflective, right? Now it looks a little weird because what's happening is the power of the specular is combining with that of the diffuse. And so it kind of looks almost like it's glowing in the sense that it's just brighter than normal. If I kill the diffuse, and I set that to 0, I'm getting a chrome object, just pure reflective chrome, okay? We do have the roughness, and this is gonna work how you would anticipate it. This is actually what's causing that blurred reflection. So at a roughness of 0, we get a mirror reflection, and a roughness of 1, we get essentially a diffuse reflection. It's still pulling the color from the face color, but it is so diffuse, it almost looks like a Lambertian result, like a Lambert. So these we would typically map, right? We don't want to just use a uniform result here. So, but for the sake of the demonstration, I'm going to leave the roughness at 0. And you can see the face color is working. Now, this is how we can kind of create metallic looking objects, right? So right now, this is just essentially a mirror, right? So we have face color. If I were to change this color to say red, I get kind of a red Christmas ornament, if you will. Now I could pull some of that saturation out, maybe darken a little bit and get that a little bit more accurate, but that's how we could create a metallic looking color, right? Now this is very different, right? So we don't have that metallic attribute here with the Pixar surface, right? So make a mental note of that. We are doing this slightly different, right? We are actually defining specular to define metallic. This is going to make sense here later. So if I change this color to something else, it'll still look metallic, but typically if it's a dielectric material or a non-metallic material, we're going to keep the color white, right? If you make it a shade of gray, that is going to kind of kill the reflection intensity. That's totally fine. In fact, this is actually normal, right? You could absolutely do this because what's going to happen is you would start adding in your diffuse here. So if I did like 0.5, we'll start to get that plastic look. And if I kind of pull back, this will look a little bit more natural, right? So it's kind of blending appropriately. If I go to 100% white, remember this is kind of adding on top of the color, and so it ends up looking a little washed out. Now we have face color and edge color. Face color is usually the easiest one to understand. Let me go ahead and kill that diffuse again. So face color is how reflective or exactly how reflective something is when we look directly at it. Okay, so think of it like an angle of reflection. So let me draw this out for you. So we have the camera, think of that as the eye here, and we are looking this way. And then we have a surface, right? So let's say this is like a wall right here. That's really hard to see, isn't it? And this would be considered that kind of 90-degree view, or in case, face color, right? Face color is essentially at 90 degrees how reflective something is, and then it kind of falls off between there, right? So it becomes less reflective as the angle changes. So this is if I'm looking directly at the object. So you can still see the book is quite reflective, right? Edge color is essentially going to be how reflective something is at an extreme angle. So something like this, right? An extreme angle. So if the camera was down here and we were looking at the table like so, we would see more of the edge color than we would see the 90 degrees. So it's using the face normals to see that. So we can control the visibility of this. So let's see that in practice, right? So let me go ahead and drop my annotation tool here. I'm going to go ahead and kill the face color, and you can see it goes completely black because, again, my gain is set to 0. It's still there. It's just turned off. If I change my edge color, if I start to bring that up, I want you to pay special attention to how reflective it is at certain angles. So I'm going to go ahead and get to an extreme angle here. So we'll kind of boost that up a little bit more. All right, so this side of the book would be considered our 90-degree reflection, right? We're looking right at it, but this glancing angle on the top of the book is becoming more and more reflective, right? This is important to understand because we're usually going to mix the two, face color and edge color. Things tend to be more reflective at a glancing angle than looking right at it, right? So if I kind of mix the two, you can see those blend right in. So face color is going to be looking right at it. Edge color is going to be that glancing angle. Now, face color is still pretty predominant. Even if we just use that, we're still going to see quite a bit of that kind of contribute. But if I were to say, like, change the color of my edge color, you can see it's still there, right? It's adding predominantly over here. All right, so that should be your takeaway there. The exponent is going to be kind of the fall off between the two, right? So if I kind of turn this off and I kind of play with this exponent, you're going to see it's going to kind of pull that in and almost treat it like face color, right? So it's almost kind of altering the view angle. If I go the other way, it's going to become less pronounced, more so, and it's going to really be just on the edge. Typically, just keep it default unless you're trying to do something very particular. Roughness is going to work just like we would anticipate. This is simply giving you blurred reflections or reflection attenuation. Essentially, the closer an object is, you can kind of see that right now. Let me go ahead and play with this. So we'll give that a little bit of color. So I want you to pay special attention to the pulley reflecting on the book here. Right, you see how clean that reflection looks? Really, really nice. Let's start to play with the roughness. I'm going to do like a value of 0.1. So we get something like this. It's going to blur further away, and then when it gets closer to the surface, it's going to look very crisp, right? So it's attenuation. This is a very expensive attribute to render, actually, right? In video games, they still fake it. Well, not so much anymore. They actually do have ray tracing now. So I take that back. Maybe in a couple of years, we'll just ray trace everything once the horsepower is there. It's still not quite there yet. It's getting better, for sure, right? But with rendering, we can actually simulate real world scenarios. So as I increase this, it's just going to blur more and more and more until the point where it's just simply unrecognizable. Okay. So let's go ahead and bring that back down here. And again, this is something we would typically map, right? Because right now it's just a universal, just kind of flat look. Everything has the same roughness, and that's just not very exciting. But as long as we understand that's what that does, great. Now, there are some advanced attributes here. We'll kind of explore this as well. We have things like anisotropy, shading tangents, and an actual bump map. So actually, if you look at the diffuse, there's actually a bump here. So if you're creating like a lacquer material or clear coat, we can actually bump just the specular or just the diffuse. Now, we're not going to be using this particular bump or this one for this assignment, but in the future, depending on what you're trying to create, that is there. It's an actual thing, right? We can create that. We're going to keep those collapsed for now. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of these other attributes here. So the reason why I want to show these is because students tend to get these kind of confused. We have under here a rough specular and a clear coat, and then of course our primary specular. So we have three attributes that are essentially doing the same thing. If you look closely, you'll even see they're named pretty much the same thing: face color, edge color, exponent, and roughness. And again, down here in clear coat, face color, edge color, exponent, and roughness. Well, that's nice. What do they do? What are they here for? Well, the only difference between them really is their starting roughness value, right? This one's 0.6. The clear coat actually has a roughness of 0.0. This one 0.00. And the primary, I think that primary starts at 0.2 if I'm not mistaken. I don't even know. Doesn't even matter. They essentially do the same thing. So if I increase this one and lower my roughness, hey, look, it's identical, right? So the problem with this is that students will connect their specular map to one of these attributes and then their roughness map to another one. That's not going to work, right? So, and I've seen this before. They'll connect their specular up here. It works fine, but they don't connect it to the roughness. They actually connect it down here. And so this doesn't matter. Nothing's going to change, right? If I put this roughness to 0, see how clean it is? I can modify this all day. We're not seeing because it's turned off. There is no face color. There is no edge color. All right, so just be aware of that. Where we connect these things is going to be super, super important. So let's go ahead and collapse these. We'll keep the primary specular open because we will be using that. But again, rough specular and clear coat, the only real difference is just its starting roughness. They are essentially additional layers if you wanted to add. So sometimes you will want to do this. Like even the face, we might have like a kind of a softer overall highlight to the character, and then we'll have a tighter highlight where the pores are, but we can kind of essentially define that with roughness maps, so it's not a huge deal. We have other cool little attributes here. I love this one, iridescence. So if you want to like simulate like an oil slick, it's built right in. There you go, right? Super cool. We won't be using that, but it is there. We have things like fuzz, which will give you kind of like Fresnel highlighting. So if you want to kind of simulate peach fuzz without actually modeling peach fuzz, we can kind of simulate that. There's a lot of really cool attributes here. We have even things like subsurface. So if you're doing skin, I would highly recommend this. Now the skin's going to be a little bit outside the scope of this class right now because you could pretty much have an entire lecture dedicated to skin, in my opinion. But things like translucency, is important to give your, if you're doing fruit, if you're doing skin, or even plastics, light will penetrate marble. Light will penetrate and scatter, giving it a very, very soft appearance. So these would be of very much use for you. And then down here, glass, right? So glass is just like you turn it on and it essentially becomes glass. So if you want like a glass book, there you go. That looks terrible. So let's go ahead and jump back into Painter. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse these to avoid any kind of confusion here. Single scatter, glass, we'll collapse all this. So again, we're going to predominantly be using the diffuse and the primary specular to essentially define everything we need to define. All right. So let's go back. And again, if you have questions, please let me know. This is my final product with the book, right? So hopefully yours is kind of on a similar level. If you don't have this much detail, that's fine. Just make sure you kind of at least hitting what the tutorial is hitting. The idea is you kind of revisit some of these as you kind of get a little bit better and you kind of finesse them a little bit more, right? So you'll get some feedback here shortly when you turn this in, and then you'll kind of make changes based off that feedback. Let me go ahead and set up the exporter here. So we're going to go up to File and Export Textures, right? So let me just make sure. So my current template right now is the PBR Metal Rough, okay? So that's pulling from the cache. So I'm going to go ahead and reset this to the traditional PBR Metal Rough. And so there we go. So I haven't made any other changes here. And yes, this one actually is changed. Let's turn that off. Let's turn that off. Okay, there we go. Don't worry about that. Yours is probably not going to have any of those settings. It actually remembers it on a file level now, which is convenient, but not so much for a lecture where you're like, I need that reset. So currently, if I were to open this and export this out, I'm going to get these textures. I'm going to get base color, height, roughness, metallic, and normal. In fact, I can show that. If I go to my list of exports here, you can see I'm getting base color, roughness, metallic, normal, height, and emissive. What I'm going to go ahead and do is actually export these out so we can kind of compare the difference between the two, right? So I'm going to go ahead and choose a directory, and let's go ahead. You know what? We'll put it in our source images. Makes the most sense, right? So I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder, and I'm going to call this book. So all your textures should go into your source images folder. That's best practice, right? We don't want to put it on your desktop somewhere. We don't want to put it in a different drive, and please don't put it on the external. Don't render from external drives. That's just going to throttle you terribly slowly because you're limited by the throughput of the USB cable. So try to keep everything in this directory, okay? Folder selected. Let's just go ahead and export this out. I'm not even going to change anything. PNG, 8-bit, all that good jazz. We'll go ahead and export. Now, I'm exporting out of 4K. This might take a little bit. Shouldn't take too long. 2K should be fine for your books. The export instructions are on FSO, but I just have 4K. If you want it to look real good, go 4K. But then you're going to have to do that for everything. So let's take a look at that file. So we have the book. I'm going to go ahead and create a new directory just for the simplification here. We're going to call this PBR. And we'll just throw all those in there. And then I'm going to bring this into Natron. So Natron's just a compositing application. Just allows me to kind of preview some of these things. And you'll see me using this to grade your stuff. So that is our height map. We'll leave that in there too. Normal. All right. I'll just create a quick backdrop for this. Cool. I'll call that PBR. And we'll come back to this. All right. So again, we're not using PBR, right? We are not going to use PBR for RenderMan. If you're going to Unreal, it might support it. You have to kind of check which renderer you're using in order to know, right? Or whatever software package you plan to go. So you might be able to use these maps if it supports base color or metallic, then you're good, right? Then it's not a big deal. But unfortunately, RenderMan is not the case. Unless you use the Pixar Disney, which is a legacy shader, that did actually have metallic. So let's go back to our settings here. Now, if you look, we actually have this tab called Output Templates. So we have a bunch of pre-built templates, and one of them just so happens to be the Pixar surface, right? Perfect. That's exactly what we need. But if we look a little closely here, I want you to pay special attention to this, converted maps. So if you look at this, this is pulling diffuse color. It's pulling specular phase color, normal, roughness, glow, presence, and displacement. So what we can do is we can kind of trace the color, right? So if you kind of like highlight these two, it'll actually tell you. In the past, it didn't do that, but that's nice. So this one's pulling diffuse. So it's pulling from over here, a converted map, right? Because we don't technically have diffuse. There is no diffuse to export because we started with PBR. We only have base color. So what diffuse is going to do, it's going to convert base color to diffuse. All right. This is actually converting the DirectX normal to an OpenGL normal. And then we're converting metallic into specular. And then what this is doing, the emissive is going to pull from the emissive, right? But we didn't actually have emissive, so there's nothing there. Height will actually plug into displacement. Opacity would pull into presence, but again, we don't have opacity, so that wouldn't be pulled anyway. And then roughness to roughness. All right. So you can actually make your own presets here. So if you need a very specific output and yours is not actually loaded, you can create your own. All right. So we used to do this for RenderMan. We would actually create our own. So let's go back to the settings and let's go ahead and change our output template. This is going to be super important that you do this every single time for RenderMan, right? Again, we are not using PBR Metallic Rough. We're going to look for the Pixar Surface RenderMan. So we have V-Ray, there's Unreal, there's Unity, there's RenderMan, Pixar Disney. We want Pixar Surface. We're going to click that. And now if I go back to my list of exports, you can see that this is now changed. Right? It's now diffuse color, specular face color, normal, specular roughness, glow color, presence, and displacement. Okay, as opposed to before is base color and so on. So that's good, right? That's fantastic. File type, PNG, totally acceptable. Do not need to change, right? Unless you want a very specific format, feel free to change it, but PNG will be perfectly fine for what we're doing. Do not do JPEG, please. There's no reason to use JPEG ever when it comes to texturing. Avoid it because that's going to introduce compression. So as far as formats are concerned, the ones we do want to use are considered lossless or they don't degrade, right? So it maintains the quality of the image. So PNG, Targa, TIFF, EXR, HDR, those are all acceptable formats. I don't even know what JPEG Extreme here is, or J2K. Sure, if it works for you or if that's what you need in your pipeline, it's there. But again, I would not use a JPEG. That's just going to degrade your quality. 8 bits with dithering, that's fine. Now, it does support up to 16 bit. So do you guys know what the difference of bit depth is? Anybody?
Gives it more color to work with, like more data.
Yes, exactly. So it's a wider color gamut. So if we look at bit depth here, this is part of your discussion. I see this image all the time. So the idea of bit depth is essentially at 1 bit we have 2 colors, essentially 2 states, on and off, black and white, right? It's very binary. But as we increase the bits, we get more color. So a 8-bit image would have 255 bits per channel. 255. Now we would do that towards the red, the green, and the blue channel. And if we had an alpha, another. So 255 times 255 times 255, that gives us 16 million color variations in an 8-bit image. Okay? Now, that's not bad, but it's not great, depending on what we're working with. For most things, it's going to be totally acceptable. For your standard image on the web, that's going to be totally fine. If we're doing something a bit more specific that needs a bit more fidelity, like a displacement map or a normal map, or even sometimes roughness maps or mask data, sometimes you're going to need more range, right? Because think about it like this. We need the gradient to be super smooth in a displacement map so we don't see stepping in the tessellation. We don't want it to just like offset like a step, right? If we had like a map like this end, you would see the actual gradient offsetting. Now, where you use it is kind of entirely up to you, right? So again, 8-bit for us is going to be entirely fine. Now we could actually set this on a per, like if we click on this book, we can actually edit these particular items and give them a higher bit depth on a per channel basis, right? So if we want to do it just for the roughness or just for the presence or whatever it is we want, we can change that, okay? We're going to stick to the global settings right now. We're going to keep looking at this. Size, we can set the output resolution. So currently it's just going to base it off the texture set size. So mine's currently set to 4K. So it's going to pull a 4K. But if I needed to down res this to 2K, I could absolutely do that. Or if I want to export out 8K and go super high res, you can do that. So why don't we just do everything at 8K and make it look amazing? Well, because file space is going to be a bit of a problem. Take a look at how big this particular file is. 20 megabytes for a 4K map, right? For the whole folder, we're sitting at around 51 megabytes. If I go 16 bits, because again, if I go with a higher bit depth, it's going to get even larger. And if I go with a higher resolution, the file is going to get even bigger. Suddenly I'm sitting at around 250 to 300 megabytes for one texture for one object. We do that a couple times. We're going to put the Call of Duty installation to shame. Okay?
Oh boy, yeah, that thing's like over 100 gigabytes now.
Yeah. So yes, on a film scenario, space is less of an issue, memory is less of an issue, but clearly most of you guys are on your laptops. We can't just start exporting out 8K everything and think we're going to be okay. Plus, it's going to take longer to render. The memory hit's going to be much more significant because those are huge. It's a trade-off.
Yeah, a terabyte isn't as big as it sounds.
No, it really isn't. Not anymore. Not for us. Not in this industry, which is, it hurts. And when you start working in compositing, I feel awful for you guys because you're working with like 4K footage. Ugh. Kiss that hard drive goodbye. All right. So we're just going to leave it kind of like this, right? The padding here is set to dilation infinite. So essentially texture dilation, if we look at this, when it gets to the edge of the UV space, it's just going to dilate or stretch that last pixel outward until it meets another shell. This is good practice because if the UVs were to not be 100% perfect for whatever reason, we at least still have some color in that area and it just doesn't go black or something. But you could turn that off if necessary, right? So we just typically keep that by default. All right, so let's make some changes here. If I look at my list of exports, you can see it's named book underscore MAT underscore diffuse color. So where is that naming convention coming from? It's actually coming again from this output template. So we can see we have something like this where it says $mesh underscore $texture set. So essentially it's pulling the mesh name, this is a variable, and then it pulls the actual texture set name. That's fine. If you wanted to modify this, you absolutely could. For me, I just need the texture set name. I would recommend you just leave this default if you're not comfortable editing this. It is case sensitive, and we want to be careful there. So again, it really doesn't matter. We could just, in fact, let's just leave it. I'm not even going to worry about that. But if I look back at my list of exports, you're going to see these update. Now it's just book material diffuse as opposed to book. Just because I had this named book back in Maya and then I added a material named book, it just kind of excessive in my opinion. So that's why I kind of just edit. You know what? I'm doing it. It's gone. All right. Also, pay attention to this. You see the bit depth here on the exporter is set to 16-bit and then 16-bit for the displacement, right? So these two typically would want that kind of level of fidelity. Right, so it should pull that automatically. But if it doesn't, we can actually tell it otherwise. So there's my diffuse, specular, normal. I can click on this little edit icon, and I can change it to 16-bit. All right. Now, we could do the same for the displacement mapping, but we are actually not going to do displacement mapping. In fact, we don't even have the presence, so this is not even going to export. But for the sake of simplicity, I can just turn these off because all I really need for this to work are these 4 channels. All right. Now we can save the settings, and that way we can just always export, and this thing will be always set up and ready to go. So we'll just go ahead and export these out. And we're going to do a quick comparison. All right, so let's take those. So this is our PBR output right here. We're going to take these new ones here. So we do have less, right? So we only have 4 here. So I'll put that one here. Roughness next, and then perfect, and then normal. I'm just kind of organizing it in the same way. All right, so let's compare base color versus diffuse. At a glance, the only thing we see change is the gold. So right now I'm looking at the base color. This is the diffuse. Base color, diffuse. All right. So the interesting thing here is how it's handling the metallic relationship, right? Where the areas that are metallic, so in the base color, all of that color information is there, right? Whether it's metallic or not. When we look at the diffuse, where it's metallic, it's actually black. Remember back in Maya, when I wanted to see this color or the reflection, I had to tone down the diffuse. This is what's happening right here. We're toning down the diffuse in that area so we can see the specular. Let's look at our roughness next. 1, 2, 1, 2, identical, right? So we can actually, if we didn't have access to a converter, we could actually use the same roughness map and it would totally be fine. Next up, metallic versus specular. Metallic simply defines what is metallic and how it treats it, right? So essentially it's kind of changing the specular within the base color model. But here you can see it's just simply white and black, right? We usually avoid, I mean, you can see I do have some grayscale values. That's just because I have like dirt overlapping on it. But we want our metals to be metallic, right? So they're usually going to be 100%. If I look at the specular, my gold is back. My yellowish color here. So essentially, if you think about it, this is going to be like a 50% reflectivity since it's just gray, but then we have this gold value. If I go back into, say, Maya, and I chose like a color like that, that's essentially what we're doing. We're giving it that metallic look. All right, let me turn off the renderer. That's going to be slow. And then if we go back in here, so again, 1, 2, metallic versus specular. These are the biggest change, right? And then if we look at the normal, this one's pretty subtle. Oops. See how it's kind of inverting? So this is the PBR output, DirectX, OpenGL. Subtle, but different. Okay? So that's going to be an important concept to understand as well, because when we connect this back into RenderMan, we have to tell RenderMan how this is being brought in and how to handle it, right? Because we need to make sure it's facing the correct way. All right, so let's finally set up some textures, right? We've spent all this time exporting it out. That's kind of the difference between PBR and the setup we're going to be using for RenderMan. So we don't need this PBR folder. I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. All we need are these 4 maps here. If you take out the height map, it will produce a displacement map, but we are not connecting it. So you can just turn that off, so make sure it's not going to be needed. All right, so now I'm going to show you a couple ways we can connect this. All right, we can use file nodes. We can use the Pixar texture nodes. We can use the hypershade. We can use everything here in the attribute editor. Each one of those will work just fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay. Now I'm going to try to discuss how to use the hypershade a little bit more so you guys can get a little bit more acclimated and a little bit more comfortable in it. You should be able to navigate it very quickly. So let's just start. Let's just assign a new material. So I'm going to hit Shift-T with both books selected. We'll do our Pixar service so we can go to our little favorite folder since we added it. Apparently it's no longer there. Great. Pixar surface. And we're going to name this book_material. Make sure you're naming your materials. Please. For every artist that you're working with, do it for them. So I'm going to show you how to do this in the attribute editor first, as that tends to be the easiest. It's pretty streamlined, right? We're all comfortable with clicking this little swatch here and loading in a texture. Then I'm going to do it again via the hypershade, okay? Now, I'm going to try to use the file node first. This sometimes has problems where the color space is not respected. Actually, you know what? I am not going to do the file node. I'm just going to show you the Pixar texture because that is like a foolproof way to work with RenderMan. The file node should work. Should, right? And if you look at the video on FSO, it will still go over the file node method, and it worked in the video, no problem. But I've been having issues where sometimes this just simply doesn't work, and it's a pain to teach two methods when I can just teach you one that does work. All right. So we're going to go ahead and click on the little swatch. We're going to connect our diffuse. Now, the file node is the traditional node we would use here. A Pixar texture is basically the file node, but a RenderMan version. Okay, that's it. So we'll go ahead and connect that. We're going to load in our file. Now, we need to navigate to our source images directory. We're going to go into the book folder, and we're going to look for diffuse color and just load that in. We already have enough here that we can actually start to render. Now, what you're going to notice right away, let me turn off my highlighting, is that this is going to look a little washed out, right? So if you remember, you see the color saturation and the value here, how this kind of looks, and then if I look at my render, it looks kind of weird, doesn't it? So this is a color space issue. And essentially what's happening is that by default, the Pixar texture is not gamma correcting our textures. This is a problem. So remember when we kind of talked about linear workflow on the very first lecture, where everything is handled in linear color space behind the scenes, right? So if I turn this off, it looks correct. But if I turn this on, it doesn't. Mathematically, this is not correct right now. And so when we apply that gamma curve, we're essentially seeing two gamma curves, right? The initial image has it encoded in it, and then the renderer has it encoded as well. I need to remove it from the image, so when we encode it back in the renderer, it looks correct. All I need to do is turn on linearize. Okay? I'm going to do that for the diffuse. I'm going to do that for the specular, but I will not do it for the roughness. So just be aware, pay special attention to what we're connecting this to, all right? So the diffuse, we're going to linearize. This is set up. We don't need to make any other changes here. If I want to go back to the root, I can click on this guy right here. This is essentially the output. This is going to take me back into this particular attribute. So if you click on these are like little connections. So this is like connecting to. So this would be what's coming into the Pixar texture. This one would be what the texture is connected to, the output, right? So if I click on this, this will take me back to the root. Let's connect our specular, right? So no other changes are necessary here. If I keep this at 1, I should get the same result I got from Painter. I could, again, lower that if necessary, if it's too bright. For some of you, that might be the case. Again, I'm going to click that little file node. We'll search for our Pixar texture. We'll go to our RenderMan, load that in. It's going to load magenta by default because essentially it's a missing color. It doesn't know what you want in there. It's like, hold on, I couldn't find the file, so there's nothing here. I'm just going to give magenta. It's letting you know something's wrong. So we'll go ahead and look for our specular map. Specular face color. Load this in. Click open. And this is going to run into the same problem where it's going to look extremely reflective until we linearize this. Now we have to wait. It's still kind of processing. So if you see that RenderMan texture, yeah, there it goes. Now, do you see how reflective this thing is? It is super reflective. So again, same idea. We want to linearize this to kind of knock that back down to its correct result. Now, I'm not worried about everything looking wet. That's where the roughness map is going to come in. All right, so far so good. I can also click on the book, and usually what that'll do, like if I click on another material, it'll I can access it. So this is another way I'll commonly get back to the root directory. So face color, we're going to connect the specular map, right? So that's connected. Edge color, I'm going to set to white. All right. Roughness, now this one's going to get a little tricky because the textures we've been connecting are RGB, right? They have RGB, and then the color swatch is considered RGB, so we can easily connect the texture node to those attributes. A roughness attribute is scalar, 0 to 1. So it's not going to play too friendly when I connect this. In fact, it's probably going to give me a dreaded menu that everyone fears. Let's see it. So we're going to look for that Pixar texture. I'm going to load that in, and oh no. At this point, this is where every student's like, nope, it's broken. Something's wrong. It's not working. It's working. All right. Now, when we connect things to like these little color swatches, Maya is kind of smart enough to know, oh, by the way, you probably want the RGB output, or you want to connect the alpha to this or something along those lines. In this case, when I connect it to the alpha, it's like, I don't know what you want. Could you tell me? So in this case, I can't connect the resulting RGB into the roughness, right? The resulting RGB is 3 channels of information, red, green, and blue. Right? So when I select that, you can see everything that's gray I cannot connect to. And one of the ones that I want to connect to is now actually gray. So if I look for that specular roughness, this guy right here, see how it's grayed out? I can't connect to it because this is 3 channels trying to go into 1 channel. I have to help it out. All right? So because there's a reason why I'm going to show you this, I'm going to look at that roughness map. If I look at the channels, right? The roughness map is 1 channel of information. If I look at the red channel, no change. If I look at the green channel, no change. If I look at the blue channel, no change. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull one of the channels as opposed to all 3. So if I pull just the red or the green or the blue, it doesn't really matter, right? They're all the same. And I connect it into the specular roughness. Pay attention to this little icon here. It's going to change immediately. Done. It's connected. All right. Now we're going to go into it. We're going to make sure we load in our file. So we'll load in our roughness. We'll give that a couple seconds. Now this one, we will not linearize. We will keep this unchecked. The reason for it is this is considered a data map. We do not want to gamma correct data maps. So displacement maps, normal maps, roughness maps, anything without color. Essentially, vector maps, or they do have color, but we would not linearize that. We do not gamma correct. So this one we will keep unchecked. All right, so diffuse, checked. Specular, checked. Roughness, unchecked. You can see that's loaded successfully. Now we have one thing, actually 2 more. Under advanced, we're just going to change the specular model to match that of Painter from Beckman to GGX. It's a subtle change. Even if you didn't do it, you probably wouldn't even notice. But if we want to be a little bit, if we want to be right about this, then we're going to change it. Finally, we're going to go down to the globals. This is going to be our global bump here. This is what we're going to connect our normal map to. Now, we're not going to connect the Pixar texture here. All right. We need a node to interpret the normal for us. The texture node is not going to do that. So I'm going to click on that little swatch, and we're going to look for the Pixar normal. Click on Render Man, and we're going to use this. Again, we are not using the Pixar texture here. That's loaded. We're going to go into it, and first things first, we're going to load in our file, right? Now, it's probably not going to take you to the right directory, so just be aware of that. It's a very common thing where I see students load in the wrong normal. And so they'll connect like the washers to the table or the table to the book or something ridiculous like that. Double check, right? It might not take you to the same directory. So I'm going to load in my normal. We'll give that a couple seconds as it kind of completely breaks my result here. I have some first world problems going on. My coffee is now empty. All right. The normals have loaded. You can see the height is now being kind of published here. But if you look closely, do you notice how this is kind of pushing outward, right? My emblem here. Let's take a look back in Painter and see what that looked like. So this is a good way to check. Those are very much pushing in, not out, right? So what's going on? The way this is being handled is incorrect, right? It's the way the normal is being utilized. So this is why we have this bump orientation. All we're going to do here is invert bump. That's it. This is now set up, and we are pretty much done, right? And we would repeat this process for every other material until we are finished. All right, so it's no different for the table. It's no different for the washers. It'll be no different for the pulley and the scraper and the wall. The bottle we're going to treat a little bit differently, but the idea will still be the same, right? And so we should get a one-to-one relationship here where what we saw in Painter is what we're now seeing in Maya. Now, if your lighting is not good, that could, you know, spell potential disaster. So again, if you need to make adjustments to your lighting, make some adjustments, right? In this case, everything is looking okay. Any questions on any of that?
No, pretty good so far.
All right, excellent. That's what I like to hear. So let's do this one more time, but this time we're going to use the Hypershade. I'm going to show you some other ways we can kind of manipulate this data. I want you guys to be comfortable in Hypershade because it is going to prove very useful for you guys. The Hypershade is a very powerful, flexible tool. So let me go ahead and I'll reset this. We'll load in the property editor you guys usually have over here. You usually have a material viewer. That's kind of going to hang up here as well. If I can get this to snap in. There we are. And then what is it? The browser. No, the browser, where it is. Create. This is like docked over here. Windows, bins. There. Default Hypershade. Super exciting. Actually, let me turn on my icons too. There you go. Now it's kind of like the default Hypershade. All right. So we're going to repeat this process, right? One more time. Selection highlighting. I'm going to turn this on just so you can see it. I'm going to grab both of these, and I'm no longer going to use this guy over here. Well, actually, I mean, we'll probably utilize it. You'll see why when it comes to like connecting things, but I'll show you another way too. Let me go to my create. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to create a new tab down here, right? So we're going to call this book underscore material. Doesn't really matter what you call it. But the tab's cool because this will allow me to kind of save layouts. So right now it's got the neutral gray. If I don't want that, I can just highlight them and select the little minus icon here, and that'll just remove it. It's not deleting it. It's just simply removing it from my graph. If I select my book material here that's already created and I want to graph this out, I can click the input-output connections. And this is a way I can kind of organize this. So now I can kind of, you know, put these however I want. For the sake of an organization, this will be really, really nice because now if I go to, say, like a new tab and I load something out here, you can also middle mouse drag these into it. And then I want to go back to my book. I just already have this laid out. So if I'm working on a more complex network, this could be extremely useful, right? Probably not so much if you have hundreds of nodes, right? That's going to be a bit excessive, but you do have the option. So we can do things like naming it, organizing it, and so on. Now we have these little controls up here. We call this output, input, output. I'm sorry, this is input here on the far left, my apologies. And then we have output here. So what the heck do these things do? So take a look at this. If I select the Pixar texture node here, and I graph the input, all I get is this, right? There is nothing connected into it. If I graph the output, I get everything that the Pixar texture is kind of connected to right now. So essentially just the book material. Again, I'm not modifying connections. I'm just displaying it for the sake of working on it. If I do input-output connections, this is going to graph essentially both what's coming into it and what's coming out of it. So essentially still nothing coming in, right? So this is why we commonly just grab the material and do input-output connections, because this is going to graph everything that's coming into it and everything that this is connected, which is the shader group, which again just gets created when we assign a material to the object. right? So these are quick ways to kind of graph things out. If we want to clear the graph, we can click that, just clear it without having to select anything. This will allow us to select or add individual nodes. So if I want to add like the neutral gray here, I can click that and just add that. The reason why this is useful is because sometimes you'll have additional textures here, right? So we have like rendering nodes. So if I want to add, say, the Pixar normal, I could either middle mouse drag into the graph, or I can just grab one and click the little plus icon. There's many ways we can kind of handle this behind the scenes, right? Let's go back. And so again, we're going to go ahead and just recreate some of these. So I'm going to go ahead and just do another Pixar surface. We're going to name it. We're going to call this, I'm just double clicking on that. We're going to call that book material 2. Again, if you already have this one, don't create 2. In fact, that's gone. And I'll delete all the textures here too. And now we can just call that book material. All right. So that is created. I need to assign it, right? Because if I change this color to say red and I render this out, it's not assigned, okay? So if I select the objects, I can actually right click anywhere here and I can assign existing material. That's one way to do it, right? I can do it here, right click on the material, assign material to selection, that'll work. You can also click here, assign to material to selection and viewport. Many ways we can do this, right? So that's rendering behind the scenes. So I want to be cautious about that because if I'm making significant changes, it might run slow. So just be aware of that. So let's go ahead and create the Pixar texture, right? We're going to connect it to our diffuse color. So again, this is our create window. We could just say Pixar texture, or we can hit tab and type in the same thing, Pixar texture. Hit the down arrow, hit return, and we've kind of created the same thing. We're going to name this book_diffuse. We should have named the file nodes prior, but I didn't. So we'll go ahead and connect in our file. Now, for me, this is just me. I don't use this material viewer. It does technically work now. If you set this to RenderMan, sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. You can actually increase. So if you go to your preferences and go to RenderMan, and we go to workflow, you can actually tell it to render swatches. And what that's going to do is actually going to render these little swatches here into the hypershade if you give it some time. So let me click save here. And it should, we can refresh the swatch here. Oh, hold on. It won't update while it's rendering. Hold on. Sorry. There it goes. So now we can actually get a preview. And it should show up here. You can see it's already giving me trouble. There it goes, right? We could even change like the shader or the interior. I would just keep it interior color. But again, you can change it to whatever you want, just an HDR. But again, this is kind of a mixed bag for me, right? Sometimes you get like a red square on the whole thing. That just means it broke. Good luck trying to get it to work after that point. I'll leave it running for now so you can kind of see it working in action. But again, as soon as I render, this is going to be disabled and these swatches won't update. I just keep it off because it's a little bit faster not compiling the shaders themselves for previews. Does it matter in a small scene like this? No. In a bigger scene, yes, you'll actually feel that performance hit. Anyways, let's get back to connecting this. I apologize. So we'll click on our diffuse. We'll load in our file. We're going to go back in, load our diffuse. We're going to linearize this. And now we want to connect this, right? So they're not connected right now. Unlike before, when we clicked this little checker swatch, it made the connection for us. What we can do, there's several ways we can do this. I can middle mouse drag. So with my book material selected, I can middle mouse drag the book diffuse into the attribute I want to connect it in, and it will connect. Okay. Now, if I highlight this node, it should give me a tooltip. Apparently it's not. Let me check, make sure my tooltips didn't get turned off. So I'm going to go to help, and why is it off? This should always be on. Now, if I highlight this, it's going to give me a little tooltip, and I can see the connection. So it's taking the resulting RGB and connecting it into the book material.diffuse color. All right. So now that I know that, this unlocks additional ways I can connect this. If I click this little white dot, I can take result RGB and connect it into my diffuse color. This is another way we can connect it. They both do the same thing. All right. If I delete that connection, I can also expand this. So if I hit 1, 2, 3, and 4, you can see that I'm getting different kind of outputs here. 1 is going to be the collapse view. 2 is just going to be whatever this is. 3 is going to be like the super kind of complete edition. 4 is going to be your default most common attributes. And I think 5 will just toggle the names up here. So again, we don't always want to see this whole collection. But what I can do is reveal the result RGB here and then still connect that into the diffuse color. And again, this will still kind of work, right? There's nothing different here. So however you do it. And then finally, the most dreaded way, if I hold shift, middle mouse drag, and release, I get that connection editor. So 4 different ways we can connect this. So again, if we look for result RGB, connect it to diffuse color, closed, connection's done. We've done this multiple ways. Whatever way works best for you, go that way. I just want you guys to be comfortable in the hypershade. Don't be afraid to play with this little noodle guy here. You can take different channels and do some interesting things, right? You may not know what specific channels are doing. Like color offset. When would I ever use that? I don't know. Maybe there's a place. Missing color. You probably, again, you're not going to use this, but you have the ability to pull from that and use it somewhere, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to collapse that. We can even enlarge this icon if you wanted to. I do have the grid turned on, by the way, with grid snapping. So 1, 2, 3, 4, essentially these icons right here. So if I hit 1, that's the collapse. 2, more expanded. 3, complete. 4, kind of the default. I'm pretty sure, I think 4 is the default. Don't quote me on that. All right, let's continue on. So our diffuse is set up. It's rendering. It hasn't updated the swatch yet. So I can refresh the swatch. You can also double click on this and that should refresh. Should. Anytime you're ready, Maya. Anytime. Not a fan of it. It hasn't been very good, unfortunately, ever since they implemented it. It used to never even be there. But even then, it's still kind of eesh. All right, so that's connected. Let's do this again. So what we can do is we can actually duplicate this node and then just simply rename it. So we could do like book specular. So I just did Control D. We'll load in the new file. So we want to get our specular. And again, this is already linearized since I duplicated it. Again, middle mouse drag into face color. I can actually do it here in the property editor. And one of the reasons I don't care for the property editor, so like these whole 2 menus, I get rid of them. Hey, look, it updated. I don't care for the property editor because it doesn't always display every single attribute. So I still use the attribute editor, but that could be a bit cumbersome. Depending on what you click on, it's going to change, right? If you hate that, you can click the copy tab down here, and this will give you a second attribute editor. That's not going to change, right? So if I click on something else, it's changing in the main attribute editor, but this is just the copy. So use that however you see fit. Book specular, that's connected. It is linearized. Good. I can also, if I want to, do something like that. Sometimes that looks nice. If you use a file node, you'll actually get a little preview here. We'll create another Pixar texture. We'll load that in. This is going to be our roughness, so we'll call that book roughness. Load in our file. Remember, this one will not be linearized. And again, if I middle mouse drag and connect this, sometimes it doesn't always work. We get the connection editor, right? Or if I, again, middle mouse drag this to the roughness attribute, I'll get the connection editor because in this case, I'm taking color into RGB. I'm sorry, into a scalar value, and it doesn't know what to pull, so we're going to help it out. We'll just do the red channel, and we'll do the specular roughness. So we have to find it. It is, I believe it is alphabetical, is it not? No, not quite. It should be listed either alphabetical or in the sense that it's structured from top down. So we have our diffuse at the top, so the specular here should be the next thing. Now, again, be careful. There is other like rough specular roughness or things like that, or diffuse roughness. Make sure we are connecting it to the right specular roughness, right? So it should be connected in the same section. Edge color does need to be set to white. Beckman to GGX. And then finally, our normal. So let's load in our Pixar normal. Load in our file. Invert bump. And we'll connect this. Now this one is using the result in to in, and we can connect that down here. Or again, just like before, we can middle mouse drag that into the bump globals, and that'll do the exact same connection. So we'll call that book normal. And we could render this whole time, and it will work, right? One thing we can also do too is we can start to isolate these specific nodes. So if we want to troubleshoot, we can do that. So I can actually solo these. This little S icon will allow me to just solo. So now I'm just looking at diffuse. Or if I want to look at the normal, there's my normal in all its glory. If I want to look at the roughness, I can look at the roughness. And the cool thing about this is going to update based off whether or not it's linearized. So I can actually see what that result is. Just make sure you uncheck it. Otherwise, it's going to render that. And then we'll get the final result. All right. So there's two good ways to kind of interact with that. I want you guys to be comfortable with the hypershade, right? You should not be uncomfortable with this. We can look at all our textures here. We can change the way this is kind of like a list view. So if you want just the names or if you want the shader balls, we can even turn off the shader ball updates. So this will turn off any changes, right? So any of your swatches will no longer update. So this is faster, right? Where this really kind of matters is when you have more complex scenes like a city. We don't necessarily want to wait for every single swatch to load. That's going to take quite some time. So sometimes you will turn this off. That's why it's there. But again, be comfortable with the hypershade. It's there to help you. Now, one last thing I kind of want to show you, and then we'll kind of break, is the little bin editor here. Like, what the hell is this thing? Let me show you. So let's say, currently we're looking at the master bin. So we're going to see all of these shaders right here. If I create a new bin, and we call this like, I don't know, cars, what I can do is assign shaders just to this. So let's say my neutral gray here in my Lambert 1, those are all part of my car. I can middle mouse drag that into the cars, and now I can just isolate that. Let me remove that one. I should be able to remove that anyway. There we go. Remove selected. So now I can essentially have, this is, again, more useful for complicated scenes, not so much for our scene, right? There's not enough shaders here to really warrant using this. But let me tell you, it's not uncommon to have hundreds of shaders, right? And it's going to be an absolute nightmare. So what you can do is have all your vegetation on one, maybe all your rocks on another, and it's just a quick way to organize it. This way you're just assigning things very, very quickly. All right? Now, I know I said that was the last thing, but there is a Substance plugin, and it will do exactly what you think it's going to do. I'm not going to show it here because it will generate some additional maps, and you would actually use the base. Actually, no, let's do it. Let's do. Oh no, I deleted the export. All right, let's try it. File, export selection. So now you're going to be like, why didn't we just do that from the get-go? Well, some people won't have that plugin, or for whatever reason, if it doesn't work, we at least now know how to do it. So let's do the PBR Metal Rough. I am going to drop, no, we'll just leave it. So let's go ahead and export this out. We'll put in a new directory. All right. So we're going to Once that exports here, we'll connect this. So it'll actually kind of do the conversion for you in the Maya Hypershade because it actually is possible. So I'll select the maps. We'll go to PBR. We'll grab it from the top down. So we're going to grab base color. We'll grab the normal, grab roughness, and metallic. And we'll click apply. And let's see what happens. Let's see if it works. Go to our Hypershade. We should have a new node here. Pixar Surface 5. Let's graph that out and take a look at that. So this is a little bit more complicated because now it's doing the conversion right in here for us. But if we look at this, it's using all the same connections, right? Actually, it connected the, it should be pulling white here, which is surprising they're connecting it there. And then we have like our normal and everything is kind of set up and you should be good to go, right? And if we render this, actually, let's make sure it's assigned. We got color space issues. Did it use the file node? Yeah, it sure did, didn't it? This is set up correctly, actually. It's just not respecting my color space. So this is that kind of problem I was talking about earlier. For some people, the file node works. For whatever reason, it's used to work for me in the past, but now it's not. So the Pixar texture should still work. And it did, right? But unfortunately, it's not respecting the color space here, despite it being set correctly.